Hello, I'm Rory McKiernan and welcome to another episode of the Love and Courage podcast. In this episode, I'm joined by the inspirational Easkey Britton. Easkey is a scientist, surfer, writer, artist and filmmaker with a PhD in environment and society. Her work explores the relationship between people, nature and especially the sea. A lifelong surfer, her parents taught her to surf when she was just 4 years old. How cool is that? And she channels her passion for surfing and the sea into social change. Her work is deeply influenced by the ocean and the lessons learned pioneering women's big wave surfing in Ireland and introducing the sport of surfing to women in Iran, which led her to get invited to give an inspirational TEDx talk, which is called Just Add Surf. So check that out later. And Easkey is also passionate about facilitating creative and collaborative processes, and she founded Like Water, a platform to explore innovative ways to reconnect people and nature, especially through water. And she also designs and organises a variety of leadership retreats, summits and programmes, especially the annual Wavemaker retreat in Portugal. Easkey currently lives in County Mayo on the wild west coast of Ireland, and she's working on her next book after just finishing her memoir, which we'll be talking about in this conversation. This episode is available also as a video over on the Love and Courage YouTube channel, and it's also on my Facebook page. Just check out Rory McKiernan. You can find me also on Twitter and Instagram and all those places. And before we do get started, I just want to say a big thanks to all the patrons who continue to support the podcast, including new patrons Gerard Boyle and Sinead Bennett. Huge thanks for all your support. And to the regular crew of legends that are monthly donors and patrons: Megan Brown, Davy Ward, Victoria Nash, Pat Ryan, Jonathan Woods, Richard Lawson, Mary Brennan, Sophia Duffy, Laura Murphy, Deborah Malloy, Cormac Anderson, Breezy Kelly, Derry O'Donnell, Ronan Brannigan, John Evi, Olive Toey, Kieran McCormick, Dermot Kirsten, Dan McInerney, Jimmy Darcy, Niall Doherty, Dara McKeown and Davy Ward, and a few donors and patrons who've also chosen to remain anonymous. You're all brilliant. It all matters. It's all appreciated. It all helps going towards promoting and developing the podcast, which has listeners in over 50 countries. So thank you. I really, really do appreciate the support. And if you want to support the podcast, haven't already, you can chip in over at loveandcourage.org. It takes just 2 minutes. Chip in $5, €5, 10, 20, a million, whatever you want, whatever you can afford, a once-off or a monthly contribution. It all is appreciated and never any pressure to do so. One thing you could do is just even share the link to the podcast, recommend it to friends, family, on WhatsApp, on social media, wherever you can. So a big thanks too, before we begin, I just want to say a huge thanks to everyone who's been supporting the ongoing launch of my book, Hitching for Hope, A Journey into the Heart and Soul of Ireland. It has not been an easy or ideal time to get a book out into the world during the course of a pandemic, but thankfully it is getting out there, and that is in no small part thanks to people like you, people who've been supporting and getting behind it. And thanks for the reviews also on Amazon, Goodreads and Google Books, and for the lovely messages, emails and social media posts that people have been sending my way. I don't take any of it for granted. So if you take 1 minute, 2 minutes out of your day to send me a message, I definitely do appreciate it, and I always respond. So my next challenge is to get the book launched in the UK, US, Canada and Australia and elsewhere after tours to those countries were cancelled for obvious reasons, coronavirus and so on. So all help, any ideas, all appreciated. And if you haven't read the book yet, you can buy the book in most bookstores and online retailers, and it's available also as an audiobook and an ebook, and you can find out more at hitchingforhope.com, hitchingforhope.com. So that's all the intro stuff taken care of. It's time to get cracking with this episode. Let's head over now to begin the conversation with the wonderful Easkey Britton. Easkey, thanks very much for joining me on the Love and Courage podcast. How are you keeping today?
Great, thanks for having me. I'm sitting in the caravan in Mayo after doing a bit of harvesting this morning.
Cool. What part of Mayo are you in?
In just outside Westport in Clew Bay.
Beautiful.
Gorgeous. So yeah, as close to the sea as I can get. That's always my number one rule.
How many meters away? Are we in meters, inches, feet, miles?
Yeah, well, you can kind of roll down the hill and then you can get straight into the sea for a swim. And then the surfing beaches aren't too far away either.
So you, like, if you wanted to go for a swim now, could you be in the water in like 2 minutes, 1 minute, half a minute?
10 minutes?
10 minutes
walking?
10 minutes walking. That's pretty good. So you're in Clew Bay. That's just at the foot of Crowpatrick or the reef?
Yeah. The reef, Crowpatrick, kind of just right. The flank of it is rises behind us. I'm on a farm here. My boyfriend and his brother bought just a year or two ago. So we're fully kind of off grid, trying to make a go of farming or market gardening. Or he is, anyways. I just come and pull a few weeds every now and again to clear the head. Yeah,
I'm sure you did more than that. So it sounds kind of somewhat idyllic. You're at the foot of a mountain, you're at the sea, there's islands, there's surf nearby. Obviously, you're growing food. Is it as idyllic as it sounds, or how is life in general there?
Yeah, it does sound pretty. I mean, yeah, I'm eternally grateful, and I've just been deeply appreciative of having that outdoor space, especially these last few months, as you can imagine. But I mean, the reality is, yeah, we've been roughing it out in this rather small caravan for a couple of years now, and the winters aren't so kind in Ireland. But it's just a way of trying to do things a bit differently. I don't know. What I find really interesting is just becoming even more aware of how finely tuned everything is. With gardening, I can't even really keep, it's terrible, I can't even really keep a houseplant alive. My sister will back me up on that one.
Wow.
So I was a little bit like, okay.
So this is really saying you're more a water
I'm definitely more a water person than an earth person.
That's been fairly established at this point, yeah.
So I'm learning a new language, definitely. But also just two things. I'm really surprised in one way how incredibly easy it is, like how accessible it is if we give ourselves a chance and a bit of time to just give it a go, having like pretty much little or zero experience when it comes to growing food and having that connection with growing your own food, that it's totally possible. And then the other realization is that it's actually, it's just how finely tuned everything is to what's going on in terms of the weather and the climate. And I always thought I was fairly switched on with the weather when it comes to surf, but I'm always oriented towards what are the conditions going to be like at the beach or the coast or for the waves. So I've never paid so much attention to like cloud cover and precipitation and rainfall levels. So we had this great growth spurt coming out of lockdown early June, and now everything's kind of a little bit dormant or stunted with all this rainfall and cloud cover. But it's all a process, which is pretty cool.
Okay, so the level of rainfall isn't necessarily a good thing for growing. Like, I don't want to turn this into
especially because it's not my area of expertise.
Yeah. We're taking a whole detour, but yeah, for someone that doesn't know a whole pile about it myself, I would imagine like all the farmers were talking about the rainfall was clearly needed, but is there too much rainfall now? This obviously being an Irish summer as well.
Well, obviously I'm interested in what's happening with our climate at large, and the impact of that. And then in Ireland too, we seem to be a little bit removed from realizing the changes already happening because of climate change and the breakdown of what were irregular weather patterns being totally disrupted. So it's definitely seems to be like just the intensity of everything I'm feeling. Yeah. Even just from a personal experience, like the intensity of the wind and the storms at the start of the year. You could always get big storms at the start of the year, and it's a great time for big wave surfing from like a surfing perspective. But it was just like the too muchness of it all. Okay. And then we pretty much ran out of water April, early May. So we had a drought for like 6 weeks with no rain. And then we've come out of that into just like a deluge. So it's interesting, of how it's... Yeah, and it's hard to know how much of a pattern that actually is. And are we more aware because actually I'm in one place for a lot longer than I have been in a while. So there's all of that too. Yeah.
Okay, so like, I will first of all, congrats on your book as well. I've just finished reading it.
No, thanks.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. I actually felt like I don't know. I felt like the whole experience of the lockdown with COVID-19 and everything, obviously it has curtailed most or all of our travels. And as someone that is a little bit nomadic, at least suffer from itchy feet or enjoy itchy feet, it really like brought me on some travels, and it just kind of tapped me back into some expansive thinking around, I don't know, just about life and adventure. And it doesn't even require one to go anywhere. It's just like the mindset of travel, the mindset of adventure. And I just thought you captured it wonderfully. So well done. Yeah.
Ah, thank you.
How was the experience of writing the book?
Oh, it's so interesting. I'd say you know a thing or two about this as well. And then being at different stages of the book writing process when the world has gone into all kinds of crazy is also interesting. But I actually wrote the book. I always had this idea in my head. I love writing. So that part of it, I didn't find a challenge at all. But I always had this notion I need to have a dedicated creative space. So I need to like go away on a writing retreat, like hermit myself away for weeks on end on an island. Talk about idyllic. But I mean, the reality was I was also working full time as a postdoc research fellow in Galway and this EU funded research project on oceans and human health. And so it's very different kind of mindset and intensity and an academic style of writing and creating new understanding and knowledge and stuff. But so in a way, the book writing ended up being this creative release for myself. And so basically just chipped away at it for like a few hours here and there. I try to create some kind of routine where I get up and have a couple of hours first thing in the day. And then I realized, kind of 2 to 4 hours, that's sort of my max in a way of what I could produce in any one day. And then I did take myself off. As last summer, I made it out to actually Turk, where I definitely did the best, my best writing, where most of the core of it probably flowed out in a week on that island. And I think it shows in the book even the influence of those kind of spaces and places and the impact of the environment and that connection to water. And then it's been a strange process, like kind of trying to get a book finished as the whole book world is shutting down.
Oh man.
So and then you were, at the other end of it. So I've been, so it was weird. I kind of completed it, did all the editing and had it, the whole thing ready to kind of go for the next stage with Mercier Press, and then it just all stopped. So it's kind of this strange kind of kind of like a extended breath hold. So it's been nice to share it with you and have some other people read it. It's still at that proofreading kind of stage right now, but so that makes it a bit more real. So it's been strange. Yeah.
Oh well done. It sounds like was that a 1 year cycle, or when did it first begin?
Yeah. Well, by the time it's due to come out now in January 2021, that'll be 2 years. Yeah.
Okay.
All in. So kind of a year and a half.
Was that the original plan, January 21, or was it due around now or soon?
Due in September. Yeah.
Okay. So it's not a big difference. No. Yeah. Brilliant. Yeah. Okay. And do you want to just tell people the name of the book if it's been finalized?
Yeah, I probably should. Yeah. So it's called Saltwater in the Blood by Mercier Press. And I suppose it's the story of, it's part memoir and my own life philosophy around my connection with the sea through surfing. And also that kind of exploring that more universal connection we have with water and what is it about water in terms of its effect on our psyche, our healing and how we connect with others. So there's a lot in terms of my travels around that kind of cross-cultural connection and experiences in particular of women. In a way, it's that more feminine perspective of the ocean as well, and a sport like surfing. So that more by feminine, I mean not just female sort of lens, but also the experience of surfing as a feminine kind of process, right? It's not just going out there and conquering, controlling these monstrous waves, for example, but just what it feels like to be fully in our bodies when we're immersed in something like water and that whole kind of sensory experience and that whole part of it too.
Yeah, I got that. I was actually really struck by one passage where you did refer to the kind of classical, like the guy who was going to get out there and smash or slay the wave, like conquer the dragon kind of thing. Whereas the more feminine perspective might be to embrace the flow state, or to become more immersive and whole with the ocean. I mean, I'm paraphrasing in a disastrous way here. So buy the book for a much more articulate description. But it did capture me. Like there was, I don't know, look, from a worldview perspective, you know, like, I don't know, I'm also fascinated by the whole spectrum of masculine and feminine, and where the scales end, and where does what does that mean even for gender? That it's not as black and white as we may have been led to believe. But certainly, and it's not that masculine is necessarily a negative as well, because there's a massive role.
No.
Like, so it's about the yin and yang, isn't it? And the Tao of balance.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think surfing is my way to explore it, and that I really feel that brings out the tension between these sort of dynamic forces at play. So it's definitely about how do you find, it's not about dominance of one force over the other. And so surfing is a combination of, obviously it's really like physically demanding, and there's that strength and commitment to like go on a wave, but then there's also at the same moment this sort of surrender and letting go to this force that's so much greater than you. And so there's that always that tension between sort of the risk taking element, and then also the need to keep yourself safe in the water. And so it's kind of that interplay of those different tensions that I think it's almost just recognizing that they're there, and it's about that. It isn't a choice that we have to make between one and the other. And that's kind of something I'm sort of realizing suppose right now over these few months too. It's strange to sort of come out of having written a book and then to have all this contemplative time afterwards. Although it's been pretty busy for me too. Yeah.
Another part of your book that captured me was, I think it was towards the end, but there's a few references, but particularly I felt intrigued to learn a bit more about your grandmother, who first brought the surfboards to, this is like the foundation myth story of Easkey and surfing, I think, where your grandmother brings some surfboards home from a holiday in California to your family home. Was that in the 70s?
Yeah.
That strikes me that it would be uncommon at the time for anybody's grandmother to be on holidays in California for a start. Never mind bringing surfboards home.
It's probably even more extraordinary. So it was, Mary Britton, she, with her husband Vinny, my grandfather, they kind of bought this small, at the time, I suppose, a small guest house at Resnella Beach that went on to become Sandhouse Hotel. And that was in the 60s. So she was also kind of working for Fáilte Ireland, so our tourism board. And that's what she was doing in California. She was promoting tourism in Ireland in like the late 60s in the US. So she was touring the US, kind of like drumming up creating this whole new, I suppose, customer base for her hotel, but also for Ireland, making that link between America and Ireland in terms of tourism, really. So that in itself, I suppose, was really pioneering. And then being in California, late 60s, in sort of surf culture speak, that's like the whole era of the kind of renaissance of modern surfing. You have the Beach Boys and Gidget and Malibu. And she actually stayed at Malibu at a hotel there. I remember her telling me the story not long before she passed. And I always wish I kind of, at the time, I was so familiar with the story in one way that I would have loved now to go back and ask her more about it. But she remarked how she stayed at this hotel in Malibu, saw these waves in front of the hotel, and were like, "Oh, we've got waves like that in Resnella." And it's the first time she saw surfing as well. And I don't know what sparked for her, how she made the link that she wanted then she ordered a couple of surfboards and got them shipped into Ireland, and God knows how that was even possible. But I think her intention really at the time was to have them for tourists, or to put up in the hotel or whatnot. But she had 5 boys, including my dad. and 4 of them all got into surfing. So I can only imagine. My dad was 12 at the time when these surfboards first arrived. And they dragged them out onto Resnarla Beach, these big, like kind of 10-foot tanks of things now that would probably be impossible for me to carry. And that's kind of how it all began, this love affair with surfing that's now become intergenerational in our family. So from my grandparents to my dad to myself, and then the next generation, I just have my sister had a baby girl last summer, and she's already been in the sea for her first swim. So you could definitely say it's in the blood.
Yeah, it seems like it's a mandatory family line there. And your parents, just reading through the book as well, like your parents like have been great surf buddies for you as well. I was struck by also your mother bringing you to Hawaii for a bit of a pilgrimage when you were around 15 or something. That must be pretty epic.
Yeah, that was amazing. I suppose a big part of my connection too was this with surfing. Was the recognition, I suppose, of that kind of what comes up is this ancestry and I suppose the history of it, and the influence of those early pioneers. And so we have very little access to that kind of, the way surf media now is just fully accessible. We can see what's going. We can watch a surf session live on the other side of the planet. But then it was really through surf magazines. And of course, all the surf magazines were all of guys surfing in the likes of Hawaii, California, Australia. But at the same, there was also this women's publication that came out in the early to mid 90s called Wahine magazine. And so I got a subscription to that, and that was my access into like how other women are surfing in the world. And my only insight into it. And I think one of the first issues I got was this copy of I talk about that as well in the book, of a Hawaiian surfer called Rel Sun, still considered kind of the queen of Hawaiian surfing today. And she was one of the, early pioneers of the women's surfing movement, getting it recognized as a professional sport and actually getting, pay, prize money and contests and things like that. But also I think she just had this real embodiment of what would be considered the aloha spirit in Hawaii. So the Hawaiian culture around this, of love, essentially, the Irish equivalent to gra, and that sense of giving. But I think this for me, it was exposure to a woman in surfing, and then a woman in surfing, who was Hawaiian, and this embodiment of grace, both power and grace, riding these really powerful waves, but in a really feminine way that isn't often portrayed in surf media. And so there was, I just was really taken with her story and just the sense of how all through her life she was always passing on this love of her sea connection, and then exploring the sea in all these different ways, both as as just an all-rounded water woman. And that just it's amazing how huge an influence this little piece in a magazine that an 11-year-old gets a hold of, and then it stays with me my whole life. So it just highlights for me now the importance of that kind of the early influencers on young girls, and the importance of mentors. And going to Hawaii was this sense of was reconnecting with that, having never got a chance to meet Rel, who died of cancer when she was aged only 47 in I think 1997. But she has such a legacy, and then going and surfing. I think that was the other thing that still stays really powerful for me. Going to her home break where she grew up in Makaha on the west side of Oahu. Again, a really kind of very marginalized part of Oahu and Hawaiian Islands, with a very large sort of native Hawaiian community and population, and also this incredible surf break that's really kind of raw and powerful. And so with this sense of being able to connect through time and space with someone else, because we're sharing the same waves, if that makes sense. So as a young woman, it's definitely a huge rite of passage.
Yeah, it also speaks to the power of each other's stories to influence and inspire others. You never necessarily know who you're going to inspire at any given time, and maybe there's a responsibility there, but there's also I guess what I'm trying to tune into is the concept of mentorship as well. When we put our voices out there, we are having an influence, whether a positive or a negative or even a neutral. But I think particularly when I'm thinking about younger people these days, I'm thinking about like, where are their influences and who's speaking to them. And, you know, politically, I have a lot of concerns about who's speaking to young people right now, particularly in the whole emergence of the far right and fascism and so on. But conversely, there's always good people seeding ideas of possibility and alternative visions. And there was another woman mentioned in your book, was really kind of struck by her. Obviously, there's no photos in the version of the book that I have anyway. But Linda Kai.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So like, you were maybe like 11 or 10 or 11 or younger, and she's this free spirited American surf woman who's camped out in Easkey in Sligo.
My namesake wave.
And I was just really struck by this Linda person and imagine what her life was, and she's kind of roaming around Ireland camping out, surfing waves, and there you're this kind of young, somewhat local woman that's been inspired by her lifestyle, and then you've gone on to kind of see that in other potentially young women and young men as well. I don't think these influences are necessarily gender constrained. But can you talk to me about Linda?
Yeah, that's so interesting you picked up on that. And it really wasn't until writing the book, having that chance to reflect on, kind of following those threads through of like, well, where, you know, how has my path been shaped in terms of my relationship with the sea, and what I value most about it, like where did it come from? And obviously with my parents instilling that passion and love for something like that. But also when you're a kid, it's really important to have, you're at that stage too. I think when I was met Linda, I was around, you know, the sort of 9 to 13 age, and they're really those kind of real identity forming years. It's that change from like childhood into becoming like a teenager, and you kind of, so there is that tendency to really not want to listen to your parents, I suppose. And that's when it's really important to have those other mentors. But then my dad would always take me down to Easkey to go and surf, which is brilliant. But I always stayed and hung out with Linda, and it seemed like the most normal thing at the time because that's just how it was. And it wasn't until looking back, I was like, wow, yeah, that was quite a life she lived, and how much I sort of admired her for that sense of freedom and independence, and to be able to travel and also move with the seasons. So she'd choose to be, you know, in Ireland in the summertime and to catch the kind of waves that she wanted, and just to live, I suppose, that ability to live a life that's totally I suppose for her living her passion, but also then looking back and realizing the sacrifices that come with that. You know, it's like, yeah, you're alone with yourself in the van a lot of the time too. And experience of, I often feel it too, and especially maybe it's a West Coast of Ireland thing, I don't know, but you get that feeling of remoteness and loneliness. It's not necessarily a bad thing. And then also at the same time, for me, feeling this really keen sense of belonging and connection to the more than human. So like not needing people around me in order to feel connected and not alone, I suppose. So every time I'm in the sea, I wouldn't feel any sense of loneliness. You know what I mean? So I wondered if that was the same for Linda. Yeah.
Yeah, like culturally, I guess the dominant culture that we're mostly brought up in is one of kind of company, entertainment, distraction, where it doesn't necessarily foster or promote silence or solitude.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, I'm kind of struck by that. And do you think that there's something innate in people that are drawn to surfers that they're seeking that, or do you think surfing gives them that?
Oh, that's a good question. I find that was hard for me to answer because I don't really remember in terms of my blueprint life before surfing. There just wasn't any. So it's definitely that's sort of an innate a part of it for me. But I do know people then who've come to surfing maybe later in life, and why they're drawn to it is really interesting. And even this kind of return, as I see it, a return to the sea in a way, I feel it's happening in Ireland. There's more of a shift, like even with people going swimming, and this kind of rise of like wild swimming or cold water swimming. Is really lovely to see. And often that's happening for people who are, adults now, maybe haven't been in the sea at all since they were kids. And so there's this vulnerability that we kind of rediscover in our adulthood that's actually really healthy by going into the sea again. So there's something about that. There's definitely this draw and pull on the sea for humans, I think, that's just natural. And it's interesting because it's kind of a paradox. There's also a huge amount of fear and danger and risk. It's a risky environment. It's not where we feel our, most at home. You have to hold your breath. We can't breathe underwater. We have to give up a lot to be in the water. But at the same time, if you look through human history, we're just always drawn towards it, and how much we've benefited from that relationship.
Yeah, and particularly as an island nation, I mean, I don't have a sense of us fully embracing the sea as a country, despite our history and heritage. It seems like also an innate kind of paradox or a contradiction in terms. But I think what you referred to there is the so-called wild swimming seems to be a call back, if you like. Do you think there's like a rising consciousness of like maritime culture and sea culture, and perhaps that's the academic and research work you're involved in as well is kind of amplifying that as well?
Yeah, sometimes I'm worried maybe I'm just in this bubble, but I definitely think and even globally, it seems to be more of a trend. What's interesting too is around this whole time of, I suppose, the lockdown that we went through, and two things I noticed with that was like this almost reawakening or realization of what's always been around us in terms of nature and our connection to nature and being part of it again. And noticing like things, lots of comments on noticing like bird song and the first primroses that kind of thing. But it was almost also at the same time as we sort of woke up to that, and the joy of that is also this kind of almost grief or the more tragic aspect of we realizing at the same time how numb and disconnected we've become. That it took a lockdown, a global pandemic, for us to slow down enough to actually realize this power of this connection that's always there, and how much we'd separated ourselves from it. And then as we began to sort of, when I say we, I'm talking, here in Ireland and in the Western world and our more urbanized cultures, because of course it's not, the same everywhere. For all peoples, in particular Indigenous cultures, have maintained this really powerful connection. But somehow this huge, this real separation has happened in our culture in Western society of disconnect. I think for lots of different reasons. And then realizing as we begin to reconnect and really value it, all the other aspect of just how much damage we've done to it. And realizing that at the same time, we become aware of bird song, kind of remembering, although it seemed really loud, I think it's because we were much quieter rather than there being more birds. Even things the last few years of there being far fewer swallows, huge, murmurations of birds blocking out the sky being extremely rare, if not almost non-existent. So and I think that's not a bad thing. I think I'm hoping that feeling of loss and grief, at least that I feel as well, will also move us to want to act as well and to take greater responsibility. But it's an interesting and challenging time.
Yeah, like you refer to a feeling of loss and grief. I wonder though, does everyone feel that, or I think Mary Reynolds referred to the concept of shifting baseline syndrome, whereby we don't necessarily know, and the next generation doesn't know what they never had, kind of thing. So that if a child has never seen a murmuration of birds, then they can't lose it. But I wonder then, you've got like tens of thousands of years of evolution, that there's something in us that perhaps knows that something is not right. And this is going beyond any parliament or policy level, that like the order of things is completely out of balance. And if you look at the whole realm of mental health and depression and anxiety, and particularly anxiety, it strikes me that one of the bigger missing links in the conversation is our relationship with nature in that. And I think it's emerging as a real-time discussion, but certainly like in the main mental health messaging and campaigns, it's like the most you often hear is like, go for a walk in the park. And it's like, it's much bigger than that, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it's huge. I mean, I love I listened to the podcast with Mary Reynolds, and I loved it, and what she said about mirroring. And I really feel that that's such a powerful way to look at it. This concept of how our health and society is mirroring the health of the planet. Like those things aren't separate. The fact that we're in this ecological crisis and climate breakdown isn't separate from the fact we're also experiencing a mental health crisis. That this notion that our inner psychological and emotional states are mirroring the outer living world, because we're not separate, even though we've done our damnness to try to separate ourselves. Like that's impossible. And I think that it has to cause psychological distress, as well as the fact of it was actually Susie was involved in Electric Picnic a couple of years ago in this event around, can we be well in a sick sea? And I just, that's always stayed with me as well, because we can't be well in a sick sea, and this other kind of thinking as well around even how we approach something like the environmental crisis. It's looked at in isolation, and totally in isolation to our mental health crisis and vice versa. But another favorite writer of mine, Robin Wall Kimmerer, writes about how if we restore the land, we restore ourselves. And I know that's something like Mary Reynolds was really talking about as well. And for me, it would be, if we restore the ocean, we'll really restore ourselves, because that's the source of all life. Water is literally life. And somehow we've just really forgotten that. And as you're saying, again, we're looking at something like with mental health and how that's going to only become an increasing issue as well, and the impact of what we're experiencing collectively. So that kind of like trauma work, what's really absent in those discussions is our relationship with nature and as part of nature. I was listening to a trauma summit online, got amazing access to all these summits all of a sudden. And it was fascinating, but it was almost entirely absent was the aspect of our relationship with nature. And I really feel that if we don't restore our relationship with the natural world, that we'll actually never be whole, because that's a huge part of us. And it just feels like it's the real missing, not even missing link. I just think it's foundational to everything else.
Yeah. It's like a fundamental blind spot in the conversation or something. I suspect a lot of it has to do with the particular training that goes on in psychology or psychotherapy or whatever. And speaking of psychotherapy, your mother, I met your mother, NC, and is she a psychotherapist or a psychologist?
Psychotherapist.
Yeah. And she specifically has done work around trauma, hasn't she, from what I understand? Yeah. So this kind of, and your father, I should say, is an artist as well. So like there is a kind of rivers flowing into the sea here, as with us all. Like, I mean, the role of anyone's parents is significant, but not always defining either. But can you talk to me a little bit about her specific influence in your work or your thinking and your relationship with her now? Because when I met you at a Electric Picnic Festival a couple of years ago, you struck me as like sisters, like more than mother and daughter. And that's not to say it isn't a mother and daughter relationship, but it struck me as like great kind of friendship there as well.
Yeah, that's been an amazing relationship, and we are really like best buddies. So there's definitely that more almost sometimes the sister vibe than mother daughter.
She's also very cool anyway with the leather jackets.
Let's be honest, she's super cool. Yeah, she'll be stoked to hear that. Yeah, and mum's work is incredible. She's been in psychotherapy for probably over 20, 30 years, working around women's health, and in particular around trauma and domestic violence, mental health. And it's interesting to see the way the more I'm going into the work of shifting from this intuitive knowing of in particular the ocean's capacity to heal and our immersion in water and the therapeutic benefit, to beginning to look at sort of the evidence base behind that. And it's like science is starting to catch up with those more ancient philosophies and belief systems around connection to nature, in particular water. I just feel like there's this gap here around trauma. Is actually a really exciting space, but for someone like, say, mum in the health service in Ireland is very excited by the possibilities of it as well. But there's just real resistance to bring in any form of change in terms of the practice of something like, let's say, like talk therapy, or this change within something like the health service, and so I think the change has to happen it is happening on the periphery in this edge space, and it's like trying to creep it in, whilst at the same time maybe it's also possible for it to come from I don't know, at a policy level. And that's at least what I was trying to do with the research in Galway with a project called Near Health. So it was funded by the EPA, our Environmental Protection Agency, and the Health Service. So acknowledging, there is a link between a healthy environment and healthy communities, and how do we better understand that in the context of Ireland and encourage greater engagement with the outdoors and nature for the benefit of health and well-being. And that'd be interesting to see what comes out of that in terms of actual impact. But the relationship with mum actually allows me to do what I love best. So I'm in academia, but I kind of bridge different worlds. So I'm most interested in how do you take this knowledge and understanding we have, and what does that look like when it's applied in practice? And then mum is someone who's really great at just taking it and going right, and immediately seeing how that works in a real lived experience and context. And then I apply it in my own work as well, around in practice, working with women around, I suppose, what you could call empowerment, but building confidence and self-connection and a stronger relationship with our bodies and each other through something like the sea and being in water. So that's like the medium, almost through this ability to connect with nature. It helps us take us out of our sort of everyday thought patterns. It's just a really interesting process that happens. So I've seen that in different contexts. I've done that kind of work around the world, with women in Iran, for example, like real cross-cultural work in Papua New Guinea, and I'm seeing other initiatives kind of spark and take off as well. That there does seem to be kind of spreading. I think, did I ramble on lots there?
No, not at all. That's the whole point. That's the whole point.
We're supposed to ramble on podcasts. Great.
The connection with nature there seems like almost like full cycle, literally, when we talk about the influence of the moon in your thinking and your work, and you obviously have written about it now in the book as well. And particularly around, like, you have a slight aversion to the word period, I believe, from what I remember of the book, or just the use of the word period, and not maybe understanding the full breadth of the cycle and the menstrual cycle, the connection with the moon. And then I just fascinated that the moon is just synonymous and integral to the ocean, and then your particular interest in women's health and women's empowerment. It just feels like a full cycle in all of it. Can you talk a little bit about all of that?
Oh, wow. Yes.
All of that there for the next 2 hours. I'll just leave you to it.
Yeah, well, I think I was interested in how that, even with the process of writing, I had to do a few things to sort of get out of my own way, if that makes sense, and this really also aversion to sort of write about myself and feeling like, how do you do that in a way that doesn't come across like totally narcissistic? And hopefully it hasn't. But yeah. So it's finding, again, writing about, I suppose in a way, a lot of my experience of surfing and learning to surf wasn't, say, about learning the skill of surfing, like how you go to surf school now and learn how to stand up on a surfboard. But it was learning about the whole ecosystem and how it all interacts. So like the weather patterns and the storm systems and low pressures thousands of miles away, and depending on how they form and interact with the wind and the sea temperature and generating these waves, and then how that interacts with what stage is the tide going to be at based on where the moon is at in the, it's just, yeah. So all of that always blew my little mind when I was a kid. And I suppose in a way, I didn't even realize I was absorbing all that kind of knowledge of these cyclical processes that create what seems like this magic, like a totally unique wave, that if I then position myself and am in the right place at the right moment, I can catch right before it sort of dissipates, and then go, where does that energy go? And I think in part the energy obviously goes back into the sea, energy goes into the shore and helps shape the coastline. And then the energy, I definitely absorb some of it. At least that's what it feels like, So that was my way to sort of realize I always had this understanding of cycles, but it was around tides and the moon. And as a woman, it took until my, late 20s, early 30s to realize, wow, hang on a minute. I also have a cycle that syncs with these natural cycles. And it was in one way just total revelation and wow. And then at the same moment, also just a shock and horror that how do I not know this? And of course I did, to a certain extent, but it was more the knowing led to this to the need to suppress it, because it was getting in the way of how I was supposed to perform, how I was expected to be, especially as a professional athlete, of, this period getting in the way. And in particular, when you're like swimming and surfing, it's just like, it's messy, and there was just I had no real, when I look at it now, I realize there's so much power in that more intimate connection with your body by understanding something like your cycle, and that all humans, we have these biorhythms, these cycles, so men and women, because we are natural species. So you have the circadian rhythm where we're influenced by the dark and the light, and increasingly we're losing our experience of natural light. And that's affecting our sleep and so on. So that's not surprising. And then as women, we're losing our connection to our menstrual cycle through drugs and medication and then also not just that, but also the story we're told about it and the language that gets used. It's really negative. It's taboo. It's dirty. And that's our bodies. We're telling our bodies this really negative story. And it's a part of ourselves that's unwanted. So I think in terms of our, when it comes to health and women's body issues, this has to be all connected, And now my experience of, I feel like I'm able to bring together this experience of, as a surfer, connection to the moon and natural cycles, and my experience of my own body rhythms in a way. So what I feel now is this ability to bring together my understanding and experience of natural cycles with the moon and tide as a surfer, with this understanding of my own inner cycle, menstrual cycle as a woman. And it's just such a powerful way for me to feel self-connected. It's like a full body mindfulness practice. And it also, the more I kind of, I guess, tap into an understanding of my own rhythms, it allows for there to be this flux, this ebb and flow. It means I don't have to exhaust and overstretch myself constantly, because I know there's a time really when my body is calling me into myself to rest, recharge, and I have a different quality to my energy. And then there's a time then when I really I'm ready to sort of be seen and be out in the world. And that was a huge breakthrough for me in terms of managing my time and energy, also helping to create better boundaries. And it excites me now because I think if we could tap into this more, cyclical approach to how we live, how we work, I think it would really help us break out of the silos that we're in and really recognize those interconnections and allow for to be this ebb and flow, which I think we also began to realize when things slowed down, for some people at least during lockdown. And just this different relationship, in a way, this different relationship with time came about through this connection with cycles.
Yeah, I'm delighted you brought up the whole ebb and flow and the idea of, stepping back from exhaustion and being overstretched. Because to be honest, when I look through your website, I'm like, how does she do all this stuff? When does she sleep? Because you also have you're still a postdoc, by the way. Are you still doing? You're essentially a researcher in academia. Yeah. So you're doing that, and you've about 45 other projects on the side, which it looks to me.
Yeah, maybe.
And you just wrote a book, and you're doing media interviews, and you're obviously surfing, but maybe the surfing is the inbuilt restoration. I don't know, but.
Yeah.
Like, do you suffer from burnout? Have you, is this a dance for you?
Yes, definitely a dance. So, and it's the constant. I'm basically coming to a place of accepting this. It's a process, and it's about constantly developing my own practice rather than reaching or retaining any sense of balance. I've nailed it now. I've got the perfect rhythm in my life. That's actually not what it's about at all. So it's just constantly this, reconnecting with nature and tapping into what grounds me, but often having to continuously remind myself of that. So the more I do this work, the more aware I become of what it is that does ground me and allowing for more of that. And that luckily is a huge part to do with my relationship with the sea. So when I go surf, that's my that's what nourishes me. And funnily enough, when I started in Galway with the research there 5 years ago, I kind of moved back after being very nomadic and traveling around an awful lot and being really quite restless. This sort of sense of homecoming. And there's no surf in Galway in the immediate sort of coastline, it's quite sheltered. And I actually reconnected with sea swimming. So, I swam my whole life, obviously, and I competed competitively, which I think that was the thing that actually killed it, the buzz for me. And so the association was very competitive, performative, chlorine swimming pools. But then this immersion in the sea was almost discovering the sea in a whole new way again for myself. So as a surfer, and then I'm also kind of researching this as well, which is, I just geek out on it a bit too much. But so my point being is actually everything I do is all connected around how do we better understand our relationship with water and its effect on us as humans, and how can we restore that relationship so that it better benefits a healthier ocean and also healthier humans. So it seems like I'm doing a lot, but that's kind of the one narrative through it all. And then for me personally, I experience it all the time. So going sea swimming in Galway and having this immersion in a part of the coastline allowed me to actually see the sea in a different way. So it was like this perspective shift. And then I wasn't in a wetsuit. I was just, bare skin, swimming, and it's just this different kind of freedom. And then I began to seek out different parts of the coast that I would have ignored because there wasn't any waves. And then through my work, I've had lots of conversations with people who, use the sea in different ways, but why and what we're drawn to. And some of us looking for those calmer corners and some of us looking for the more wave exposed ones. And I just think there's just so much possibility there in terms of a reconnection, coming back home to our bodies. And even that feeling in Ireland, say with the swimming, is this sense, obviously the cold water, you can get cold water shock, which is not good, but gradual immersion build up to it over time, does create this full body experience and immediately takes us out of our heads, because we have something like 30 trillion cells in our body that are pretty much ignited as soon as we're in water, and they're all speaking to each other all at once. So it was those kinds of lived experiences at the same time as I was sort of researching the science behind how does water change us now.
Yeah, you're really making me want to go jump in the sea now.
Oh, good.
And to be honest with you, I've been ignoring it a bit too much recently. And I think there's something, where I certainly I suffer from the whole like too many projects syndrome, and so many of those happen to be online, or you end up online for whatever reason. And there's something about being online that I feel like is dullifying, it just really like numbs your being, and it takes the sparkle out of your eyes and leaves you a bit sort of almost like zombie-esque, and like, there's my phone, and like, I definitely I suffer from this. So I'm not like preaching to anybody about being in any way superior, but there's definitely, when I get into the sea, it like destroys all of that static energy or negative energy or whatever it is, and like almost reminds the whole biology, the whole system, that it's a human, that you're human, and that the world is out there. So I can definitely see I felt the impact, but I certainly see the systemic potential, whereby you've like hundreds of thousands of people in any given moment in Ireland, and certainly tens or hundreds of millions of people globally that are suffering from like what has been pathologized as a mental health, but it's really a lot of it's about being removed from being human, and then we're brought into this kind of funnels of whether it be therapy or medication. And it's not to take away from the role of any of those, but there are ways to prevent that numbness occurring as well, or to remind ourselves of the aliveness, which can be the medication in some ways. I don't know, like it's difficult to speak about these things when you're not a medic, and then it can get dismissed because it's not grounded in research and so on, so forth, which is why we have kind of PhD scholars like yourself and others. But it's almost like we need a convergence now of all the variety of medical and scientific thinking to come together. And there's my rant over. Sorry.
Yeah, no, but I think it's hugely important what you said. Like, there's a massive opportunity right now to bring more of this into, public policy, public health discourse. That's where it needs to be. It shouldn't be fringe. And we need this sort of like global restoration when it comes to our relationship with nature that isn't like itty bitty and piecemeal. And there are really strong like emerging trends around like surf therapy, ocean therapies that are starting to be prescribed. And in a way, it's almost like we need a new language too around and how we create a culture around that, because there's an issue around medicalizing nature and turning it into obviously another commodity of what it can do for us. And it's not like you can reduce it into like, prescription pill. I don't think we ever should. But, as an integral part to how we look at our health as a whole, that has to be there. And it's foundational. And it's how do you create a language where you can speak to people who are in like public health, for example. And there is actually really strong evidence, and we're really trying to like build that and get that out there as well around things like with immersion in the sea and with water, its impact on things, on mental health in particular, and in depression, what happens at a neurological level, physiological in our bodies, and in a way it can be captured. And another way, obviously, the challenge is you're dealing with this incredibly fluid, dynamic, complex environment that shouldn't really be reduced to its parts, And so, in a way that speaks to, well, how do we look at a more holistic system and approach to health? And I think there's a real opportunity for that now. We've realized, actually, again, this mirroring, we've ended up creating this pandemic because of how shockingly awful and damaged our relationship is with the environment. And I hate even saying the environment. There we go, language straight away, like creating the separation, that it's like this sort of backdrop to our lives rather than it being this sort of living, breathing life force that we're just tangled up with.
Yeah. What's coming to mind is the notion that we talk about the Department of Health in government, where it, it's often said it's the Department of Ill Health. Actually, what it's talking about is illness a lot of the time, or what it's responding to is illness. Whereas I think there is a pretty serious move towards wellness and well-being, where that should be the fundamental kind of currency, and that should kind of dictate the script for everything. And even where economics are concerned, like just because something is kind of economically beneficial to a country or to a GDP or GNP, it might be actually quite damaging to people's well-being or the overall well-being. So we need new kind of metrics, and I think you're seeing some of this come into play around the coronavirus and the pandemic, whereby you kind of have economic measures being taken, but they're actually damaging health and vice versa. So it's kind of like the need for holistic thinking all around it, outside of silos is really what's needed, is kind of equality, where the department or the Minister for Health, the Minister for Finance isn't in any way superior to the Minister for Health, and the Minister for Culture, for that matter, isn't out on the fringe. And you see that all the time with art and the role of art, that it's put out on the fringe as, we all like a bit of music and a bit of art, but let's put them over there. Whereas they are all like integral parts of a functioning ecosystem. But talking about art kind of brings your father to mind. And obviously I was at his launch of his last book in Ballyshannon, and with his art exhibition. And
that's right, yeah.
Like, I don't know, I kind of really struck by the imagery, and I could really feel all of these things coming out in your book. I was trying to, I suppose my mind wanted to categorize and pigeonhole your book, because that's what we're kind of trained to do to some extent. But there's so many different things going on. Like, you've got poetry in the book, like it's punctuated with poetry. There's like art, there's psychology, there's surfing, there's academia, there's spirituality, there's women's health. Like, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. But can you talk to me about like art in your life, and maybe perhaps the link between your dad and art, and then where that leaves you with art and painting and whatever?
Yeah, because you've captured me at an interesting time, because I've actually, I'll still keep a foot in the door with academia, but I actually finished with my time in Galway, and kind of decided, it was before this whole pandemic thing happened, I had intentionally decided my contract on the Oceans and Human Health project I was on with the European Union, it finished at the end of May. And I intentionally decided I was going to take what I kind of call a creative leave of absence. And I was thinking of, I think the reason why I did that is that I began to feel like, there's huge changes that are needed, I think, within academia as well as a culture. But it was just that intensity, that the relentless sort of pace of always on hyper productivity, that I would just find myself resisting more and more, and then wanting to create this just like breathing space. I could almost feel it in my chest. It would build, and especially in the last year or two, I thought, okay, I entered academia because I thought it was a space where you could really, reflect, critically think, read, write. There wasn't hardly time for any of that. And I think I decided I needed to create that space and in a way leap into the unknown again. I almost felt like, how do I put this? Like, my imagination was under threat. My that creative energy really wasn't being fed anymore. And so I felt like that wasn't, and not putting a blame on anything. And, but I felt it was my responsibility, really, if I recognized that, to do something about it. So instead of following a nice, tidy career path, I mean, that's what I've always done, though. I've just at that moment gone, maybe it's the surfer in me, with the risk taking. I don't know. But it gets back to the art of realizing that's a huge part of myself. I had completely sidelined and hadn't painted in over a year. And that for me was like alarm bells. So my kind of two indicators are, am I getting enough time in the water? Like, when was the last time I surfed? And then the other one is, which is usually I need to be in the water at least a couple of times a week. If I've gone a week, it's a bad sign. And then, when was the last time I painted? And I was like, well, that was a year. I was like, okay. It's not that but you can't do everything all at once is the other thing. And so it was just prioritizing my art became a big motivator, actually. And not that I intend to actually do anything with it, other than I just knew I needed to create this creative space to reconnect with that part of myself. Otherwise, it can very easily be lost. Yeah.
I'm just wondering about, you said you didn't want to blame anybody, which is understandable, but like, what if we do blame? I just see this time and time again where amazing people end up quitting their jobs because they're being pushed into like a very kind of production line way of operating that is based on not always wise or sensible KPIs and milestones, and like it's a factory type way of achieving change, and it's not necessarily the best way, and it doesn't always take into account the need for human pauses where we need to breathe or explore or read or create. I think that's just the world of work, perhaps, where it's gone, and people then end up getting burnt out. And so often, and I include myself again in this spectrum, where we end up leaving and going back onto the margins, if you like. And maybe that's where we belong. I don't know. But what if organizations were to fully embrace that spirit? Then everybody could be winning here, that you don't end up having these organizations that claim to be or are making change, but aren't really radical and aren't transforming anything. They're actually just recreating the dominant paradigm in it with a nicer guise. And I see this in the nonprofit sector all the time.
Yeah,
okay. They just become kind of mirrors of the state or the corporate entities. That they're not like fostering human connection or happiness. Another rant of mine here.
No, it's so true. I mean, I'm not the only one. It's a conversation I've had, with colleagues of mine, and it's typically happens to those of us who, is in these kind of, fixed term contracts. We're postdoctoral research fellows. There is a real hierarchy within academia as well, but probably throughout business. But I think with academia, it's a lot more structured and very siloed, and there is less, I suppose, in a way, flexibility to, I don't want to say progress, but so you're in a kind of precarious position. You don't actually really have a position of power, even though you might have been there a long time. At least that's how it feels. And so that would need to change, It's like we are on the margins even within the system.
Okay.
And then you think, well, what's the best way to affect change? If I try to do it from the inside out, I'm going to totally burn myself or alienate myself. And then if you kind of jump outside of it, and I've been, both sides. Outside of it too, you're so isolated. You lose a lot of the supports. So I'm curious about, is it possible, without totally stretching myself, can you create, is there a space in between? There has to be, like this middle way. And I think there is. There are interesting things I'm seeing happen. Like another project on the horizon is with the Eden Project in Cornwall, who set up Eden International, kind of founded by Sir Tim Smith. But they're really interested in looking at, I suppose, in a way, a more radical approach to how we look at these global challenges, how we think about education, how we learn, and alongside our connection with the environment. And So I'm wondering, it's what I'm trying to get at is like how it is time to create these new collaborations and partnerships. And there's definitely enough of us now, I feel, that are thinking differently. And in a way, it's like, well, what if we all just got together and tried it out, like a great big social experiment. And I think it's time to really do that, to take risks, to fully, in a way, it's like we're kind of making a mistake if we think we can figure it all out or solve all the problems in this moment. But it's about how do you create this new process of change. And in a way, it speaks to a book I was reading by Rebecca Solnit, just republished recently. I have it here. Have you read that one, Rory? Hope in the Dark?
No.
Brilliant. And on the topic of hope as well, I find it really interesting because I kind of went through a phase thinking maybe hope might be a bit useless. But I just wanted to share how she describes how hope is not about what we expect. It is an embrace of the essential unknowability of the world. So this is embracing the unknown is actually where like the hope lies. And I don't know, I really like that because I feel like that's constantly what you're having to do as a surfer, embracing the unknown and knowing of when the next wave will come. But there's, preparation that happens while you're waiting for the next wave to come, right?
Love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good note to end on, Easkey, is this idea, because, I mean, we all, in many ways, globally, politically, socially, environmentally, existentially, we're in the dark as to we never know. And I think, like, to just kind of walk forward or even swim forward into that unknown, but without fear, to kind of embrace the ebb and the flow, as you've been speaking so wisely to. It's been fantastic to spend this time with Easkey, and I look forward to the next adventure as to where all of this brings all of us, really. It feels like it's all about adventure and exploration, and it sounds like that's what you've signed up for, and keep surfing those waves without using too many cliches now. So yeah. And just best of luck with your book, Easkey, and I hope everything goes great with the launch and everything, and look forward to supporting it when it comes out.
Thank you. Yeah, likewise with yours.
Thanks, Easkey. Hello, Rory here again. If you enjoyed that conversation with Easkey, please do help share, get it out there far and wide to reach more people. It's also available as a video on the Love and Courage YouTube channel and on my Facebook page, Rory McKiernan, Hitching for Hope. If you do feel called to chip in on a once-off or a monthly basis, just pop over to loveandcourage.org. It takes just 2 minutes and all support is massively appreciated. And don't forget to check out my book if you haven't already, Hitching for Hope. Check out the information and links to where you can buy it at hitchingforhope.com. And for those that have read it, love to hear your thoughts. And if you did like it, reviews on Amazon, Google Books and Goodreads, all appreciated. Social media posts, all that stuff. It all matters. It's all appreciated. And I thank you all for tuning in and all the support. Until next time, here's to all of us in creating a world of more love and courage.